The morning Ella Wallace realized she had not cooked for another living soul in 4 years was the same morning she found a wooden crate sitting on her porch boards as though it had always belonged there, packed full of the most beautiful vegetables she had ever seen in her 31 years of living in the territory of New Mexico. She stood in the doorway of her small adobe house on the edge of Cimarron, the October air of 1884 pressing cool against her face, and she stared at that crate for a long time. Carrots with their green tops still on, fat and orange as sunset. A cluster of pale onions, their papery skins whispering in the breeze. 3 good-sized squash, golden and heavy. A bundle of dried chili peppers tied with a length of twine. And on top of everything, set there deliberately and without apology, a folded square of paper. Ella did not pick up the paper immediately. She looked out across the yard instead, scanning the bare cottonwoods, the dusty road that curved away toward town, the open pasture beyond her fence line where her 2 horses grazed in their slow, indifferent way. Whoever had left this crate had come and gone before first light, or near enough to it that she had not heard a thing, and she was a light sleeper. She had been a light sleeper for 4 years. Sleep was the one thing grief had not taken from her, but it had sharpened it, made it brittle and easily broken. She crouched down and picked up the note. The handwriting was careful but unpracticed, the letters a little large, the pressure of the pencil heavy on the page. It read, "Mrs. Wallace, I have more than I can use before the frost takes the rest of it. I hope you will accept this without offense. I mean none. L. Underwood, the Sandoval property." She read it twice. Then she folded it back along its original crease and held it in her palm and thought about Lionel Underwood, whom she had seen perhaps 4 times in the 2 years since he had come to work the old Sandoval land. He was a tall man, quiet in the way that some men were quiet not from lack of things to say but from a discipline she had never quite understood. She had spoken to him once, a brief exchange outside Harmon's General Store when he had held the door for her, and she had thanked him and he had nodded and said it was no trouble, ma'am, and then they had both gone about their separate business as though the moment had never occurred. She looked at the crate again, the carrots, the onions, the squash that would make a soup capable of warming something deep inside a person. She had not made soup in 4 years. She had not made much of anything in 4 years, not really. She fed herself because the body demanded it, in the dull mechanical way of someone going through necessary motions. She ate cornbread and dried beans, and whatever the neighbors occasionally left at her door the way they still sometimes did, 4 years later, as though her grief were a wound that had never properly closed and they were still bringing bandages. She was grateful for those neighbors. She was also sometimes exhausted by them. They looked at her with a kind of careful tenderness that reminded her, every single time, of what she had lost, and there were mornings when she did not want to be reminded. What she wanted on most mornings was simply to exist without the weight of other people's sympathy pressing down on her. But this crate did not feel like sympathy. It felt like practicality, plain and straightforward. He had more vegetables than he could use. He had left them. There was something almost businesslike in its simplicity, and she found, to her own surprise, that she appreciated it. She carried the crate inside. The kitchen of her adobe house was small and clean. The walls smoke-darkened above the iron stove. A row of clay pots on the shelf above the window, dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beam, because she had always kept dried herbs even through the worst years when she had not used them for much of anything. The habit had persisted even when the purpose had not. She set the crate on the table and stood back and looked at it in the kitchen light, and something stirred in her chest that she could not immediately name. It was hunger, she decided. Simply hunger, nothing more complicated than that. She picked up a carrot and turned it in her hands. His name had been Thomas Wallace, her husband, and he had died in the summer of 1880 when a fever swept through the mining camps up in the hills above Cimarron and took 6 men in the span of 2 weeks, and Thomas had been the second. He was 34 years old. They had been married for 7 years, and they had loved each other with the kind of steady, unspectacular devotion that does not look like much from the outside, but is in fact the strongest thing two human beings can build between themselves. When he died, something in Ella had gone very quiet, and 4 years later it was still quiet, and she had grown accustomed to the quiet the way a person grows accustomed to a missing limb. She and Thomas had not had children, though they had wanted them and waited for them, and eventually stopped talking about wanting them because the waiting had become too heavy a thing to carry in conversation. There was just the two of them, and then there was just her, alone in the adobe house with the clay pots and the dried herbs and the iron stove she rarely fired past the bare minimum required to keep herself fed. She began to sort through the vegetables. The onions she set in a row. The carrots she laid beside them. She picked up one of the squash and pressed her thumb against its skin and felt how solid and right it was, full of its own substance. She reached for the dried chilies and held them to her nose and breathed in their sharp, smoky sweetness. She cooked that morning. She did not plan to, or rather, she had not woken up planning to, but once she had the onions and the fat cut open and the smell of them rising in the pan, she could not stop. Her hands remembered what to do. They always had. Cooking had been one of the great pleasures of her life before, one of the ways she expressed love, and standing now at the stove with the heat coming up and the smell of butter and onions filling the kitchen, she felt something move in her that was not quite grief and not quite happiness, but something that existed in the thin, startling space between the two. She made a soup. She made enough for two. She stood over the pot and looked at the two portions and understood in a slow and quiet way that she had been thinking of Lionel Underwood the entire time she was cooking. This was not romantic, she told herself firmly. This was courtesy. The man had given her vegetables and she intended to repay the gesture with a hot meal, because that was the decent thing to do, and she was a decent woman. She ladled the soup into 2 tin pails she sealed with their lids, and she set them side by side on the kitchen table, and she looked at them for a moment, and then she went to get her coat. The Sandoval property was 2 miles east of her place, following the road until it bent toward the river, and then cutting across the pasture on a narrow track that was visible in the dry grass if you knew where to look. Ella knew where it was because she had known old Ignacio Sandoval when she was a girl, before his family had moved east to be closer to his wife's people, and she had walked that track many times as a child carrying messages between the ranches. She carried the 2 pails and walked the 2 miles in the cool October morning, and the sky above the New Mexico high desert was the color of hammered tin, clouds moving fast from the northwest in long flat layers. The cottonwoods along the river had gone fully gold, and their leaves came off in gusts and drifted across the road ahead of her in quick, papery rushes. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of an axe coming steady and rhythmic from behind the main barn. She followed the sound around the corner of the building and stopped. Lionel Underwood was splitting wood. He was coatless despite the cold, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he moved with the particular economy of a man who had done this particular work so many times that his body had optimized every motion down to nothing unnecessary. He was perhaps 35 years old, she thought, maybe a year or 2 older, with dark hair that was sun-lightened at the ends, and a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days. When he heard her footsteps on the frozen ground, he looked up and stilled with the axe held easy at his side, and his expression went from focused to careful to something she could not quite read. "Mrs. Wallace," he said. "Mr. Underwood," she said. She held up the pails. "I made soup. I wanted to return the favor." He looked at the pails, then at her. "You didn't need to do that." "I know I didn't need to," she said. "I wanted to." A pause. The wind moved between them and took a curl of wood smoke from somewhere and stretched it thin against the gray sky. He set the axe down against the chopping block and wiped his hands on his trousers. "Well then," he said, "I thank you. Would you—" he stopped, started again. "Would you like to come inside? It's cold." She had intended to hand him the pails and walk back. She had been very clear with herself about this on the walk over, but the wind chose that moment to pick up sharply from the north and cut straight through her coat, and she heard herself say, "For a few minutes, perhaps." His kitchen was bigger than hers and considerably less organized. There were tools on the table, and a pile of harness leather heaped on a chair that had clearly been waiting to be mended for some time. There was a coffee pot on the stove that smelled strongly of something that had been sitting since early morning. He cleared the tools off the table in a few quick movements that had the look of a man embarrassed but not paralyzed by embarrassment, which she respected, and he set the leather in the corner and pulled out a chair for her. "Coffee," he said. "Please," she said, though she suspected it would be terrible. It was quite terrible. Strong and dark and burned, the way coffee gets when it has been sitting on a low heat since before the sun came up. But she drank it, and he opened the pails, and they sat at the cleared table in the big kitchen, and she watched him have the first spoonful of soup. His face changed. It was subtle, but she was watching carefully because she found she could not help watching carefully, and she saw the way his expression shifted, a small internal adjustment, the way a person looks when something unexpected touches them. "This is good," he said, not as a compliment exactly, more as an acknowledgement of a fact he had discovered and was reporting honestly. "Thank you," she said. They ate. The quiet between them was not uncomfortable, which surprised her. She had not sat in a kitchen with another person, eating a meal she had cooked in 4 years, and she had expected it to feel wrong, or too large, or weighted with something unbearable. But it did not. It felt like what it was, 2 people eating soup on a cold morning in October. "How long have you been working the Sandoval place?" she asked. "Coming up on 2 years," he said. "I leased it from the family's estate. They were settling things after old Ignacio passed." He looked up. "Did you know him?" "I knew his wife better, Clara. She used to teach me to braid the Ritas when I was very small." She smiled at the memory and felt the smile move across her face in a way that seemed to surprise her own muscles. She had incredible patience. "She sounds like she was a kind woman," he said. "She was." He ate another spoonful. "Where are you from originally, if you don't mind my asking?" "I was born here," she said. "My father came out from Missouri in 1848 before the territory was fully settled. He built the house I live in now." "That's rare," he said. "Most people out here are from somewhere else." "And you?" she asked. "Texas originally," he said. "East Texas. Before that my family was from Georgia, but I never knew Georgia. I drove cattle for a long time, Kishom Trail and others. Got tired of the moving." He looked at the window and the gray sky beyond it. "This place suits me, the quiet of it." She understood that. She had felt the same about Cimarron her whole life. The way the mountains held the sky and the river kept its own counsel, and the land was big enough that a person could exist inside it without being swallowed. She finished her soup. He finished his. He poured her more coffee, which she did not particularly want but accepted because to refuse would require more finality than she felt ready for. "The garden," she said. "How much of it is left?" "Enough that I won't get through it alone before the frost comes hard," he said. "I've been canning what I can, but I haven't got the patience for it, honestly. My mother always said canning was its own art, and I believe her because I have not mastered it." "I used to do quite a lot of canning," Ella said, and then stopped, because the used to felt large and she did not want to explain it. But he did not ask her to explain it. He simply nodded, as though "used to" was a complete and sufficient sentence, which she supposed it was. She stood to leave. He walked her to the door, and she picked up the empty pails from the table as she went, and he held the door and looked out at the sky. "It's going to snow before long," he said. "Maybe a week, maybe less." "I expect you're right," she said. "If you'd like more vegetables before then," he said, carefully, "you're welcome to come by the garden and take what you want." She looked at him. He was looking at the sky and not at her, which she thought might be deliberate. There was something considerate in how he had offered it, as though he were making sure she knew she was not obligated. "Thank you," she said. "I might take you up on that." She walked back across the pasture with the empty pails, and the wind at her back pushed her along the track toward home, and the gold leaves of the cottonwoods came down around her in a rush. And somewhere between the first step and the last, she realized that something had shifted, very quietly, inside her chest, in that deep place where the quiet had lived for 4 years. She was not sure yet what the shift meant. She only knew it was there. 3 days passed and she did not go back to the Sandoval property. She went about her days as she always did, tending the horses, hauling water from the well, mending fence along the north pasture line, where one of the posts had heaved up in last spring's wet and never been properly reset. She read in the evenings by the oil lamp, history mostly, and whatever newspapers came through on the mail coach every 2 weeks. She was not a woman who required company to feel settled in herself, or she had not been in a long time, and yet she found herself thinking about the kitchen with the tools on the table, and the terrible coffee, and the way Lionel Underwood had looked when the first spoonful of soup had touched him. On the 4th day she went to Harmon's general store for flour, and she ran into Margaret Dutton, who was the postmaster's wife and one of the more comprehensively informed people in Cimarron regarding other people's business. "Ella Wallace," Margaret said, and embraced her with the particular warmth of a woman who had worried about someone for a long time. "You look well. You look better than well, actually. There's color in your cheeks." "It's just the cold," Ella said. "Have you met our new neighbor properly? Lionel Underwood. He came to Sunday services last week for the first time, and Reverend Hayes nearly fell over from the shock." Margaret smiled. "He's a quiet one. Very well-mannered, though. Brought a dozen eggs for the church supper and didn't say a word about it to anyone, just left them in the kitchen. I had to ask 3 people before I found out who left them." Ella bought her flour and thought about a man who left things without announcing himself. That evening she made cornbread and a second pot of beans, and she told herself this was simply what she was doing, and there was nothing to examine about it. On the 5th day she went to the garden. She told herself she was going for the vegetables and nothing else, and this was true as far as it went. The garden at the Sandoval property was in the flat ground behind the house, sheltered on the north by a long, low wall of stacked stones, and it was more substantial than she had expected, perhaps half an acre of turned earth with the orderly rows of what remained of the season. Squash and root vegetables mostly, the things that held on into autumn, and on the far end a section of late kale that had survived 2 light frosts and was the better for it. She was filling her basket with kale when she heard him come out of the house. "I was wondering if you'd come," he said. He was carrying a cup of coffee, and he looked slightly less disorganized than the last time she had seen him, his shirt tucked properly and his hair combed, though the effect was somewhat undermined by the fact that he was clearly wearing yesterday's work coat. "I said I might," she said. "You did." He came to stand at the garden's edge and looked at what she had gathered. "The squash on the west end are still good. The frost hasn't touched them yet." She went to look. He was right. She loaded 3 more into the basket and straightened, and found him watching her with an expression she might have called thoughtful if she were being generous, or uncertain if she were being accurate. "Mr. Underwood," she said. "Lionel," he said. "Please, Mr. Underwood is my father, and I have mixed feelings about my father." She almost laughed. The almost laugh surprised her. "Lionel, then," she said. "Mrs. Wallace." "Ella," she said, because it only seemed fair. "Ella," he said, and something about the way he said her name, quietly as though he were setting it somewhere safe, made her look at the ground for a moment. "Would you stay for a meal? I don't cook as well as you do. I have that on the authority of my own soup, which was adequate at best, but I can feed a person adequately." She looked at the basket of kale and squash in her hands. She looked at the sky, which was lower and grayer than it had been all week, the kind of sky that kept its promise. "The snow's coming soon," she said. "Today, I think," he said, "which is all the more reason to come inside." She stayed. He made a reasonable stew with salt pork and the last of his onions, and he was right that it was adequate, solidly adequate. Not beautiful the way her soup had been, but honest and filling, and made with the focused attention of a man who took seriously the few things he knew how to do. They ate at the table, which was clear this time, she noticed, though the harness leather was still in the corner. "You haven't mended that yet," she said, nodding at it. He glanced over. "I keep meaning to." "What's it for?" "One of the bridles. The cheek piece keeps slipping." He looked at it. "I could work around it, but it bothers me. I don't like working around things." She filed that away as a thing worth knowing about a person. "I don't like working around things." The snow came while they were still eating, not with any drama but simply arriving, the light outside the window going flat and white, and the first flakes coming sideways in the wind. They both looked at the window at the same moment and then at each other. "You'll want to get back before it settles," he said. "I should go," she agreed, but she did not immediately move. "Or," he said and stopped. "Or," she said, "or you could wait it out here, see if it passes quick." He said it to the table rather than to her. "I'd feel better knowing you weren't walking 2 miles in a snow squall." She thought about the empty adobe house waiting for her, the quiet of it, the single lamp burning by the chair, the book she had already nearly finished. She thought about the 2-mile walk in snow that was already coming down with some conviction. "I'll wait a little while," she said. The snow did not pass quickly. By the time an hour had gone by, it was coming down in earnest, soft and dense, and the view from the window was nothing but white. Lionel Underwood built up the fire and found a second lamp, and Ella Wallace sat in the kitchen of the old Sandoval house, and did not feel, she noticed, the particular pressed-down weight of another person's presence that she had come to expect from all the well-meaning neighbors who came to her house with their careful eyes and their casseroles of sympathy. She felt instead something closer to ease. He asked her about her horses, and she told him about them. The big bay she had called Cormac, and the small gray named Pip that had been born on her property 5 years ago, and had never once in its life done anything it was told without first arguing about it at length. He laughed at that, a real laugh, not polite. She found she liked his laugh. It arrived with some reluctance, but when it came it was entirely genuine, and it transformed his face from careful and contained into something much more open and immediate. He told her about the cattle drive years, the trails from Texas up through Indian Territory and into Kansas, the long months of dust and thunderstorm, and the particular loneliness of riding drag at the end of a herd. He had been doing that work from the age of 18 until his early 30s, and he spoke of it without nostalgia, but without bitterness either, the way a person speaks of a time that shaped them without defining them. "Did you ever think about settling sooner?" she asked. "I thought about it plenty," he said, "but I didn't know what I'd settle into. A man by himself on a piece of land is still just a man by himself. The land doesn't fill the house." He said it matter-of-factly, not as a plea or a declaration, just as a thing that was true, and she heard it as such. The snow stopped near 9 o'clock. It had laid down perhaps 6 inches on the frozen ground, and the night outside the window was clear and ice-bright, the stars coming back out hard and cold above the white landscape. Ella put on her coat, and Lionel went to the barn and saddled his horse. "I'll ride you back," he said. "The road will be icy." "I'm perfectly capable of—" "I know you are," he said. "I'd feel better." She looked at him for a moment, standing in the barn door with his horse saddled and his coat buttoned to the throat and that careful, patient expression. She had known men who insisted on their own helpfulness as a form of authority. This did not feel like that. This felt like what it said it was. "All right," she said. They rode back along the river road in the dark, with the snow gleaming around them and their breath coming white in the frozen air. The cottonwoods were weighted with snow, and the whole world was muffled and clean and enormous. They did not talk much on the ride and did not need to. He waited until she had gone inside and lit the lamp before he turned his horse and rode back. She stood at the window and watched the darkness close behind him and held the warmth of the lamp in her hands and thought, "This is something. This is the beginning of something." And she was not afraid of it, which was what surprised her most. Over the next 3 weeks, which brought 2 more snowfalls and the first real cold of the New Mexico winter, Lionel Underwood found increasingly reasonable occasions to come by Ella Wallace's property. He came once to look at the fence post she had mentioned and reset it properly in the frozen ground, with a degree of thoroughness that she thought was slightly beyond what the fence post required. But she did not say so. He came another time because he had been into town and thought she might want the newspaper a day early, and she let him in for coffee, which she made properly, and he drank it with the expression of a man who had forgotten that coffee could taste like this. She went twice more to the Sandoval property on her own account, once for the last of the kale and once simply because she had baked bread and she had baked too much of it, which was only true in the sense that she had deliberately baked twice what she needed. She did not examine this too carefully. She was 31 years old and she had been grieving for 4 years, and she knew herself well enough to know that if she examined it too carefully, she would find some reason why it was impossible or inadvisable or too soon. And she was no longer willing to be argued out of good things by the colder parts of her own mind. On the second Sunday of November, Lionel appeared at the door of the small clapboard church in Cimarron for the first time since the week Margaret Dutton had mentioned. He stood in the back while Reverend Hayes preached on the subject of the Good Samaritan, which Ella thought was almost too thematically convenient to be accidental, and she was aware of him standing there the entire service in a way she was not usually aware of the 40 other people around her. After the service, in the cold churchyard where everyone gathered to talk for a few minutes before the cold drove them to their homes, Margaret Dutton found her way smoothly to Ella's elbow in the way that only Margaret Dutton could, having apparently identified several weeks ago a development she found satisfying. "He's been asking about you," Margaret said very quietly with her back to the main group. "Has he?" Ella said. "Nothing inappropriate. He asked my husband whether you had any family nearby. Whether you got on all right." Margaret looked at her with bright, frank eyes. "My husband told him you were the most capable woman in the county and that you had good neighbors who looked after you." And Mr. Underwood nodded and looked at the floor for a moment in a way that told me everything I needed to know. Ella looked across the churchyard to where Lionel was shaking Reverend Hayes' hand, nodding at something the Reverend was saying with his hat in his hands. "Margaret," she said. I know," Margaret said. "I'm only telling you because 4 years is a long time, and I have watched you be very lonely with a great deal of dignity. And I think dignity is all well and good, but a person needs more than dignity to keep them warm." There were things Ella might have said to that. She said none of them because Lionel Underwood had finished with the Reverend and was crossing the churchyard toward her with his hat still in his hand, and the look on his face of a man who has made a decision and is going to see it through. Mrs. Wallace," he said, and then catching himself. "Ella." "Lionel," she said. Margaret Dutton discovered an urgent need to speak with the woman standing on the other side of the churchyard. "I wondered," he said, "whether you might want to come for supper tomorrow if the weather holds. Nothing elaborate, I've been practicing." "Practicing what?" she said. "Cooking," he said. "Since apparently adequate isn't as high a bar as I thought." She looked at him. He was looking at her with something straightforward and a little nervous in his eyes, the kind of look that came from a man who did not do this often and was not sure of the ground beneath him. "What time?" she said. The supper he cooked the following evening was considerably better than adequate. He had clearly applied himself. The beef slow-cooked in a cast-iron pot with dried herbs and root vegetables. The gravy done with care, corn bread that was golden and properly textured. She commented on this, and he admitted that he had ridden into town in the morning specifically to ask the cook at the hotel whether there was something wrong with his cornbread, and the woman had told him he was using too much soda and not enough of the good fat. "You asked the hotel cook for cornbread advice," she said. "I asked her for honest feedback," he said. "She obliged." "Was she surprised?" "Considerably," he said. "I believe she thought I was asking to admire her recipe. She seemed uncertain when I pulled out a pencil and started writing things down." Ella laughed at that, a full laugh, easy and unguarded, and it rang in the kitchen of the old Sandoval house, and she heard it as though from a slight distance, as though part of her were listening to make sure it was real. It was real. It landed warm in her chest and stayed there. After supper they sat by the fire and she asked him something she had been wanting to ask since the beginning. "Why did you leave the vegetables?" she said. "You could have kept them or given them to anyone in town." He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. The fire popped and settled. "I'd seen you," he said simply, "a few times coming and going. And I'd asked around a little, the way you do when you're new somewhere and trying to understand the place." He looked at the fire. "People spoke about you with a great deal of care, the kind of care that has weight to it. I knew you'd had a loss, and I knew you'd been managing on your own for a long time." He paused. "And I had the vegetables, and I thought, she probably eats less than she should, because people who are alone often do, and that seemed wrong. That seemed like something that could be fixed with very little drama." She looked at his profile in the firelight. "You weren't trying to be a good Samaritan," she said. "No," he said. "You were trying to feed me," she said. "Yes," he said, and turned to look at her directly. "I was." She held his gaze for a long moment. There was something very clear and very quiet in it, like a pool of water in still air. "Thank you," she said, "for that, for doing it the way you did without making it into something I'd feel obligated to." "That seemed important," he said. "It was," she said. "It was the most important thing." They sat for a while longer, and the fire burned down, and the cold pressed at the windows, and they talked about small things. The easy talk of two people who have moved past the formal part of knowing each other and are beginning the real part. She told him about her father and the early days in the territory, stories she had not told anyone in years because there had been no one to tell who did not already know them. He listened with a quality of attention she had rarely encountered, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually receiving what she said, and it made her want to keep talking, to pull things out of storage and see how they looked in the air between them. She rode Cormac home in the dark and the cold, and the sky above the New Mexico desert was impossibly thick with stars, the Milky Way pouring from one horizon to the other, and she rode under it with her breath coming white and her heart feeling something she was now prepared to name. December arrived with a week of hard weather, and then eased into the kind of clear cold that makes the whole high desert landscape look like it has been cut from glass. The mountains to the west were white above the timber line, and the air smelled of pine and ice and wood smoke. Ella and Lionel had fallen into a rhythm by then without discussing it as a rhythm, the way two people fall into something when they are paying attention to each other and not to the rules. He came to her place twice a week, and she went to his once, and they ate supper together and talked and sometimes just sat by whichever fire they were near and read separate books in a companionable silence that felt, to Ella, like the most extraordinary luxury she had encountered in years. She had told Margaret Dutton about it in the most general of terms, because Margaret would find out regardless and it was better to control the information, and Margaret had pressed both of Ella's hands and looked at her with glassy eyes and said absolutely nothing, which was the kindest thing Margaret had ever done. There were things they were still careful around. She had not told him everything about Thomas yet, the full weight of it, the shape of the marriage and the loss. He had not told her everything about himself either, the years before Texas, the family in Georgia that he had clearly not left on easy terms. They were both people who had learned to be careful about the weight they placed on others, and they moved toward each other at the pace that felt safe rather than the pace that urgency might have demanded. On a Friday evening in the second week of December, while they were eating her stew at her kitchen table, he said, "I want to tell you something." She looked at him. "I want to tell you because I think you should know it before anything else develops between us," he said, "and because I'm not a man who likes the idea of anything important being hidden." "All right," she said. "I was married before," he said, "a long time ago. I was 23 and she was 21, and we were both very young and very wrong for each other. And after 2 years she went back to her family in Louisiana and I went back to the trail, and we had the marriage dissolved in 1873. He was looking at the table. "It wasn't ugly. We were not unkind to each other, but we were not right for each other, and we both knew it, and I think we were both relieved when it ended, which is its own kind of sad." He looked up. "I wanted you to know." She thought about it for a moment. "Did you love her?" "I thought I did," he said. When I was 23, I think what I actually loved was the idea of not being alone. That's not a very good basis for a marriage. No, she said, it isn't. She reached across the table and put her hand over his briefly, a simple and deliberate touch. Thank you for telling me. He turned his hand over under hers and their fingers were close together for a moment, not quite interlaced, not quite separate, before she withdrew her hand and went to put more wood on the fire. 2 days later she told him about Thomas. Not in a rushed or reluctant way, but deliberately, sitting across from him at the table with her hands around her coffee cup and her eyes on the middle distance, telling the story of Thomas Wallace in the way it should be told, with love and without apology. Thomas, who had come from Virginia and learned to love the territory the same way she had been born loving it. Thomas, who had a gift for fixing broken machinery that had made him invaluable to every rancher within 20 miles. Thomas, who had died too young in a summer that had taken too many men from Cimarron, and whose absence had been a shape she'd been living around for 4 years. Lionel listened without interrupting, without trying to find silver linings or offer consolations. When she had finished, he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "He sounds like a man who deserved to live longer than he did." "He did," she said. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said. "I mean that without the formal weight it usually has. I mean it as one person to another." "I know you do," she said. They looked at each other across the table, and something passed between them that was not yet the thing it was moving toward but was undeniably and clearly on its way there. The understanding between two people who have been carrying their own histories honestly into the same room. Christmas came quietly to Cimarron in 1884, the way it came to most places in the territory, with a service at the church and a gathering at the community hall, and the particular festive warmth of people who had been isolated by winter, and who took pleasure in being near each other for a few hours in the lamplight. Ella and Lionel arrived separately and left together, which was noted by everyone who needed to note it and forgotten by everyone who had more pressing things to think about. Margaret Dutton said nothing, but her expression was of a woman who has been proven right about something important. He had brought her a gift, modest and exactly right. A small leather-bound notebook with the initials E.W. pressed into the cover, because she had mentioned that she used to keep a journal before and had stopped and thought she might want to start again. She had brought him 3 jars of the preserves she had put up from the last of his garden vegetables, because she had finally gotten around to the canning she had been thinking about since October, and the look on his face when he opened the cloth bag and found them was worth considerably more than the effort they had cost her. They walked back to her house in the cold Christmas dark, their boots crunching on the packed snow, and at the door she turned to face him and he was looking at her with an expression she recognized now, the open and immediate one that replaced the careful and contained one when something in him released. "Ella," he said. "I know," she said. "Do you?" he said. "I think I've known for a while," she said. He kissed her. It was not dramatic or rushed. It was the kind of kiss that is also a question and an answer at the same time, given and received with equal intention, and when it ended, she kept her hands on the front of his coat and looked up at him in the dark and felt the quiet inside her, that long, 4-year quiet fill with something warm and living. "Come in for a while," she said. They sat by the fire and talked until late into the Christmas night, and the talk was different now, easier and more direct, the way talk gets when two people have admitted something they have been moving toward and no longer need to orbit carefully around it. He told her about East Texas in the early days, his father who had been hard-handed and stingy with his love, his mother who had been the opposite and who had died when he was 12, and left a gap in him that he had spent 20 years walking around. She told him about the miscarriages, 2 of them, early enough that she and Thomas had barely told anyone, but real enough that she still thought about them sometimes with a quiet sadness that was not the same as grief but lived in the same country. He took her hand when she said that and did not let go of it for a long time. The new year of 1885 came in cold and bright, and with it came something that neither of them had spoken aloud yet, but that had become the tacit understanding between them. This was serious. This was the real thing. Not the young wanting not to be alone thing, but the real thing that comes when two fully formed and honestly worn people look at each other and say yes to the weight of who the other person actually is. In January, they began having supper together every evening, alternating houses, and the arrangement felt natural from the first day, as though it had always been in place, and they had simply forgotten to start it earlier. He began keeping his sharpening tools at her house because her whetstone was better than his. She began keeping her spare reading lamp at his house because his lamps were placed for a man who did not read in the evenings. These small domesticities migrated between the two properties like birds between nesting sites, and neither of them remarked on it, but both of them noticed. One Tuesday in the middle of January, a difficulty arrived in the form of a man named Dale Purvis, who was the brother of the man who had operated the small freight business that Thomas Wallace had worked for in the months before he died, and who had come to Cimarron on some undisclosed business of his own, and who found Ella at the general store. He was a thick-shouldered man in his 50s with a disposition that sat somewhere between suspicious and aggressive, and he had always had the quality of looking at Ella as though she had something that belonged to him, which she had never been able to account for exactly. "I heard you've been keeping company with that cattleman from the Sandoval place," he said without preamble in the middle of Harmon's store with Ella's hand on a bolt of wool fabric. She looked at him steadily. "That's my own business, Mr. Purvis. Thomas has been dead for years," he said. "You might show a little more. Thomas," she said quietly, "would want me to be well. Now please step aside." Purvis looked at her for a moment with that dark, suspicious quality, and then stepped aside, because Ella Wallace at her most composed was a formidable thing, and even men who thought they had a grievance tended to recalibrate when she directed her full attention at them. She told Lionel about it that evening. She told him directly as a thing that had happened and that she wanted him to know about, not as a distress signal. He listened to the whole thing and then said, "Do I need to speak to him?" "No," she said, "I handled it." "I believe you," he said. "I'm asking whether you would like me to." She thought about this. "No, he's not dangerous, he's just unpleasant, and I don't want you tangled in his unpleasantness on my account." He accepted that. He did not push it further, did not let his jaw go tight in the way some men did when they were deciding to handle something regardless of what a woman said. He accepted her account of her own situation and moved on, and she was more grateful for that particular quality of his than for almost anything else. Purvis left town 3 days later, and she did not see him again. The episode closed and left no trace. February brought a storm that lasted 4 days and kept both of them locked to their own properties. And on the 3rd day of the storm, Ella sat at her table with the new notebook he had given her for Christmas and wrote in it for the first time. She wrote about Thomas and about the 4 years after Thomas and about the crate of vegetables on the porch, and then she wrote about Lionel Underwood, his hands when he split wood, his laugh that came reluctantly, the way he said her name as though he were setting it somewhere safe. She wrote that she was falling in love with him, that she thought she had been falling in love with him since the morning of the soup, and that the falling felt nothing like falling. It felt like finding ground. On the 4th day the storm broke and the world outside was blinding white and enormous, and Lionel came across the pasture on horseback through the deep new snow and knocked on her door. "I was going out of my mind over there," he said. "Come in," she said, laughing. "Come in and I'll make you something hot." She made flapjacks because it was morning still, and she had the good maple syrup that the general store had gotten in from the east, and they ate at her table with the winter sun blazing through the window and the whole snow-covered world outside looking like it had been made new. He watched her cook with an expression she was familiar with now, a specific expression she did not have a word for exactly, something between contentment and attention, the face of a man who was exactly where he wanted to be. "Ella," he said, over the flapjacks. She looked at him. "I'm going to say something and I want you to hear it fully before you respond," he said. "All right," she said. "I love you," he said, simple and direct, the way he said most things that mattered. "I have for a while. I wanted to say it clearly because I don't believe in letting things that are true go unsaid when the person who ought to know them is sitting right across the table from you." The winter sun lay white and warm on the table between them. "I love you too," she said. "I wrote it in my notebook 3 days ago because I wanted to be sure of it before I said it out loud, and I am sure of it. Completely." He reached across the table and she took his hand and they held onto each other in the blazing morning light. And outside the snow lay 3 feet deep, and the mountains were impossibly white, and the sky was the deep saturated blue of a thing that has been washed clean. He proposed to her in March, on a warm afternoon when they were both working in what had been her kitchen garden, and that she was planning to expand for the coming season, kneeling in the turned earth with dirt on both their hands and a warm wind coming up from the south for the first time since October. He did not make a ceremony of it. He looked at her across the turned earth and said, "Marry me. I want to make a life with you properly, on whatever terms feel right, in your house or mine or somewhere new. I don't care about the terms, I care about the fact of it." She looked at him for a long, full moment. A hawk circled very high above them in the pale spring sky. "Yes," she said. "Yes." He stood up and crossed to her through the soft, dark earth and took her face in his hands and kissed her once, deep and certain. And they were both laughing when it ended, the easy, helpless laughter of people who are genuinely happy, and the hawk above them banked on the spring wind and was gone. They were married in May of 1885 in the small clapboard church in Cimarron, Reverend Hayes officiating with a particular solemnity, undercut by the fact that he could not entirely suppress his own smile for the first 10 minutes of the ceremony. Margaret Dutton was there in the front row with her husband, and she wept with cheerful and unapologetic thoroughness throughout the whole proceeding. The community turned out in considerable numbers because Ella was one of their own, and because even the most reserved members of Cimarron's population seemed to have arrived at the collective view that this was the right thing happening at the right time, and that there was a kind of grace in it worth witnessing. Ella wore her mother's dress, remade at the waist and sleeves to fit her properly, cream-colored lawn fabric with a faint spray of embroidered flowers at the collar. She had done the alterations herself over the winter evenings, and when she had put it on that morning and looked at herself in the glass, she had thought of her mother and of Thomas both, and felt them present in the room in the way the gone sometimes are, not as grief but as warmth, a surrounding warmth that wished her well. Lionel wore a dark suit he had sent to Santa Fe for, and a white shirt that Ella had pressed for him that morning while he stood anxiously nearby asking whether she was sure he needed to wear the collar piece. And she had told him yes, absolutely yes, and he had submitted with a good grace that made her want to kiss him, which she did briefly, before the starch set. He held her hands during the ceremony and looked at her the entire time, not at the reverend, not at the assembled congregation, at her, with that particular expression, the open and immediate one, and she looked back at him and felt the whole of her life until that moment, the good years and the hard years and the 4 years of quiet, as a road that had led here specifically and necessarily to this man's hands holding hers in the May sun. They did not take a honeymoon trip, because neither of them was particularly interested in travel for its own sake, and because there was work to be done at both properties that could not be left for long. They spent their first week married at the Sandoval place, which had more room and which Lionel had been steadily improving over 2 years, and they talked about the future with the practical intimacy of two people who have chosen each other for reasons that go past romance into something more durable. "My house could be let," Ella said, "or we could keep it for now and see." "Keep it for now," he said. "It was your father's. It should stay in your hands a little longer while we figure out what we want to do with the land." She loved him for that, for understanding without being told that the adobe house was not just a building. They kept both properties through the summer of 1885, working them jointly, which turned out to mean more work but also more hands, and the combined gardens that year were extraordinary, every row of them tended with what Ella could only describe as collaborative devotion. She brought the canning discipline she had always had, and he brought the sheer stubbornness of a man who would not let a vegetable go to waste, and they put up more jars than they could use in 2 winters, which meant a great deal of it went to neighbors, which meant the neighbors of Cimarron ate very well that autumn. She cooked every evening in the kitchen of the Sandoval house, which was her kitchen now, and she put everything she had into it. She cooked the way she had cooked in the good years with Thomas, with all her attention and love in it, and she cooked for 2 and sometimes for 3 or 4 when they had people for supper, and the table in that kitchen became the kind of table that people remembered being at. In October of 1885, almost exactly 1 year after she had first found the crate on her porch, she stood at the kitchen stove in the early morning and began to understand that something was different about her body. She stood very still with the wooden spoon in her hand and let the understanding arrive fully. She told Lionel that evening, sitting across from him at the supper table, with a directness that she had learned was the best way to tell him important things. "I think I'm expecting," she said. He was very still for a moment. Then he put down his fork and looked at her with something in his face that was enormous and unguarded, so open she almost had to look away. "Are you certain?" he said. "Certain enough," she said. "I've thought so for 2 weeks and I kept waiting to be wrong, but I'm not wrong." He came around the table to her, and she stood up, and he held her with such careful intensity that she pressed her face into his shoulder and felt her eyes fill, not with grief, not this time, but with the overwhelming present weight of something real and good. The winter of 1885 moved around her with a gentleness that seemed conspiratorial. Lionel adjusted the firewood situation in both stoves before she could ask. He rode to Santa Fe in December specifically to bring back a medical pamphlet a doctor there had recommended, and he read every word of it in the same way he had read the cornbread recipe, with a pencil and complete seriousness. She felt well. She felt better than well. She felt most mornings like a woman who has been given back something she had believed permanently lost, and the feeling was so large and so pure that she handled it carefully, the way you handle the very best of things. Their son was born in June of 1886, on a warm Tuesday afternoon with the summer light pouring through the bedroom window and a neighbor woman, Mary Castillo, who had midwifed half the children in the county, present and efficient and calm throughout the whole of it. Lionel sat in the hallway outside the door and apparently could not sit still at all, because Mary Castillo told Ella between contractions that she could hear him walking back and forth out there like a man who had forgotten how to stop. The baby arrived in the middle of the afternoon, loud and emphatic, and Mary Castillo put him in Ella's arms, and Ella looked at his red, furious, perfect face and felt the world reorganize itself around a new center of gravity. When Lionel came in and she held the baby up to him, his face did the thing it did when something moved him without warning. He took the baby with his large, careful hands, and the baby stopped crying almost immediately, which Mary Castillo said was a good sign of the father's temperament. "What do we call him?" Lionel said in barely above a whisper. She had been thinking about this for months. "Thomas," she said, "if that's all right with you." He looked at her with the full weight of understanding what she was offering, the name of her husband before him, given to their son not as a wound but as an honor. "It's more than all right," he said, his voice not entirely steady. "It's the right name." Thomas Underwood came into the world in June of 1886 and changed everything about the house on the old Sandoval property. He was a loud and enthusiastic infant with his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes, and a personality that declared itself immediately as a force to be reckoned with. Ella's adobe house was let to a family newly arrived from Colorado, and the Sandoval property became simply home, a word she had not used about a place in 4 years that held its full weight. The territory around them was changing in those years, As the 1880s moved on, the cattle drives were winding down, the Great Trail era coming to its end as the railroads extended their reach into the Southwest. New Mexico was growing into itself, the population spreading into new towns, the old conflicts between the large landowners and the small ranchers that had marked the previous decade slowly resolving into something resembling order, though slowly and never without friction. The Lincoln County days were a decade back, but their aftermath was still in the ground, in the way men spoke about land and water rights, in the careful calibrations of who trusted whom. Lionel had navigated all of it with the quiet steadiness that she had recognized in him from the beginning, the quality of a man who knew what ground he stood on and did not need to shout about it. He was not without enemies, in the way that any man with a good piece of land and honest dealings eventually acquires the enmity of men whose dealings are not. But he was also not without friends, and the community of Cimarron had long since made its assessment. She had gone back to keeping her journal through all of it, the way he had hoped she would when he gave her the notebook. She wrote about Thomas, the small Thomas, her son, with the same devoted attention she gave everything, recording his firsts with a precision that she knew she was accumulating for the future, against the inevitable day when memory would need help. She wrote about Lionel, too, still, the way she had from the beginning. Small observations, specific moments, the way he looked in the early morning light reading the newspaper, the way he spoke to the horses, quietly and without condescension, as though they were colleagues. The way he looked at her sometimes, when he thought she was not watching, with an expression that she could only describe as the face of a man who still could not entirely believe in his own good fortune. She understood that feeling. She had it too. In the spring of 1888, when Thomas was nearly 2 years old and had progressed from walking to running to an apparent belief that running was merely a slower form of climbing, Ella found herself expecting again. She told Lionel in the same way she had told him the first time, directly across the supper table, and he looked at her with the same enormous, unguarded look, and this time she had longer to look back at it because she was not herself fighting tears. "A second one," he said. "A second one," she agreed. He reached across the table and she took his hand. Young Thomas, informed of this development in age-appropriate terms some weeks later, thought about it seriously, and then said that he hoped the baby would be good at climbing, because there was a cottonwood down by the river that required 2 people. Their daughter was born in December of 1888, right at the turning of the year, as though she had timed it for maximum symbolic effect. She was small and fierce and arrived faster than Thomas had, and she had Ella's coloring lighter, with the pale eyes and the steady gaze that Lionel said immediately, and with complete conviction looked exactly like her mother. They named her Clara, for old Ignacio Sandoval's wife who had taught Ella to braid Ritas, and for the kind of patience and grace that name called up, and because Ella had carried the name inside herself for years as one of the good things she had known, and it seemed right now to pass it forward. Clara Underwood was, from her first weeks on Earth, a person with precise and firmly held opinions about everything. Thomas adored her with the immediate ferocity of an older sibling who has been waiting for someone to be devoted to. Lionel called her his strong girl from the beginning, not as a consolation for being a girl, but as a simple recognition of what she obviously was. The house was full. Ella sometimes stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the main room and looked at the fullness of it. Thomas on the floor with his wooden animals, Clara in her cradle making the focused, intense sounds of a baby with a great deal to consider, Lionel at the table with the lamp on, and his reading glass that he had recently and grumpily begun to need for fine print. And she felt the sheer, substantial reality of the life she had built, in the rubble of the life she had lost. With this man who had left a crate of vegetables on her porch one October morning and changed everything. She thought about the 4 years before. She honored them. She did not erase Thomas Wallace from the fabric of her life, because she could not and would not, and it was not necessary. Lionel had never asked her to. He understood from the beginning that her first husband was not a rival but a chapter, an essential one, without which she would not have been the woman who opened the door that morning and saw the crate and made the soup and walked 2 miles in the October cold and found his kitchen with the tools on the table and the terrible coffee and all the rest of it. She had told him once, lying in the dark after one of the children had finally gone quiet, that she was grateful for the way he had come into her life, quietly and without announcement, leaving things and waiting. "I was afraid to be any other way," he said honestly. "I could see you were a woman who had been handling things alone for a long time. I didn't want to be one more thing you had to handle." "You never were," she said. "I tried," he said. "You more than tried," she said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "I'd have left vegetables every week for a year if that was what it took." She turned toward him in the dark. "Would you?" "Longer," he said, "if that's what it took." She pressed her face against his shoulder, and the children were quiet, and the house was warm, and the New Mexico night lay enormous and starthic around them. And she understood that what she felt at that moment was not happiness in the simple, surface way of the word, but something deeper and more structural, the kind of contentment that is built from real materials and real loss and real choice, and that has the weight and permanence of something made to last. The years moved through the late 1880s and into the 1890s with the accumulated weight of lived time. Good seasons and difficult ones. A drought in 1889 that cost them 2 bad months of water worry before the rains returned. A dispute with a neighboring rancher over grazing rights that lasted 2 summers and was ultimately resolved through the county court in their favor. Thomas started school in the fall of 1891 and announced at supper on his first day that the school teacher was very clever but organized her books in entirely the wrong order, which Ella found so familiar in its specificity that she had to press her lips together to keep from laughing. Clara turned 3, and then 4, and then 5 in her emphatic and opinionated way, accumulating skills and convictions at equal rates, learning to ride before most children her age would have thought to ask, learning to read from her mother at home in the evenings with a focus that Ella recognized as the same focus she herself brought to the kitchen, total and absorbed. The garden expanded every year. Ella had taken what Lionel had planted and made something larger of it, adding a proper herb section and a dedicated section for the chili peppers that had always grown wild in the territory, but that she found could be cultivated with considerable results. The canning operation had grown to the point where she had traded her surplus with half the households in Cimarron and had begun, in a modest way, to sell jars at the general store, which Harmon had suggested and which had turned out to be, if not a business exactly, then a contribution to their income that was nothing to overlook. She had not stopped cooking, not for a single day since the morning of the crate. She cooked the way she breathed, as a fundamental and necessary expression of herself, and she cooked for the people she loved with everything she had. One evening in the summer of 1892, when the kitchen garden was full and the chili peppers were blazing red on their stakes and the smell of the evening meal was drifting out through the open windows and across the yard, Lionel came in from the barn and washed his hands at the basin and stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her cook. "What?" she said without turning around. "Nothing," he said. "You're looking at me." "I'm allowed," he said. She turned and leaned against the counter and looked at him, this man she had been married to for 7 years, who was a little grayer at the temples now, and had needed the reading glass for 3 years, and who she loved with the full and documented certainty of a woman who had written about it in 4 notebooks and still was not finished. "What are you thinking?" she said. "That I have no idea what I did to deserve this," he said, "but that I intend to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of it." She crossed the kitchen and took his face in her hands and kissed him once, warm and deliberate. "You left vegetables on my porch," she said. "That was sufficient." He laughed, and the laugh was easy and immediate, not reluctant at all anymore, and she felt it move through his chest under her hands. And outside the window the summer evening was all gold and green, and the children were in the yard, Thomas chasing Clara through the long light, both of them loud with it. The New Mexico Territory moved toward statehood slowly through the 1890s and into the new century, and Ella and Lionel Underwood moved through those years together with the steady, mutually sustaining pace of people who have found the real thing and know better than to waste a minute of it. They had one more child, a second son, born in 1894, whom they named James after Lionel's mother's father, the one member of the Underwood extended family whom Lionel spoke of with unambiguous warmth. James was a mild and cheerful child from the beginning, in charming contrast to his older siblings' intensity, and he became from early on the family's diplomat and mediator, the one who smoothed things over between Thomas's certainties and Clara's convictions, with a patient good humor that neither of his parents could quite account for but were grateful for daily. Thomas, at 16, was interested in law. He had gotten this from the dispute over the grazing rights that had ground through the county court for 2 years, which he had followed with a focused attention that his father had found alternately amusing and slightly unnerving. By 17, he was reading everything he could find on territorial law and corresponding with a lawyer in Santa Fe who had agreed, somewhat reluctantly, and then with increasing enthusiasm, to take him on as a reader. He had his mother's gray eyes and his father's methodical quality, and a relentless moral seriousness that was entirely his own. Clara was 12 and had recently decided that she was going to know everything about plants that it was possible to know. The herbal knowledge she had accumulated from her mother had expanded in directions Ella had not anticipated, into the medicinal knowledge of the territory's older residents, the Hispano families who had been here for generations, and the Jicarilla Apache people whose land the whole territory had once been, whose knowledge of the local plants was encyclopedic, and whose willingness to share it with a serious 12-year-old who came asking respectful questions had produced, over a year, a herbal notebook that the doctor in Cimarron had taken to borrowing. Ella thought about this sometimes, the way the injustices of the territory's history were written in the land itself, in who had been here first and who had been pushed out, in the languages that had been suppressed and the knowledge that had survived anyway because it lived in plants, and in the people who still knew how to read them. She talked about it with Clara with a directness she felt the subject required, because her daughter was going to live in this territory and do work in it, and she should know the full truth of its ground. Lionel had his own version of this reckoning, from the cattle drive years when he had ridden through land that had been someone else's long before it was anyone's ranch, and they had talked about it in their kitchen over many evenings in the way that two people talk about the large things when they are honest with each other about the world they live in. The kitchen of the Sandoval house, which had been their kitchen for 10 years by the mid-90s, had accumulated itself into something that bore the perfect imprint of its inhabitants. The tools were kept to a dedicated shelf and not on the table. The harness leather had been mended years ago and 3 replacements since. There were 5 clay pots on the shelf above the window instead of Ella's original 3, and dried herbs still hanging from the ceiling beam, but considerably more variety now than in the early years. There was a row of canning jars always visible on the back shelf, and on the wall near the door, hung at a child's height when it was first put there, and now positioned slightly too low for adults because no one had moved it, the small framed photograph taken at their wedding in 1885. Ella in her mother's altered dress, Lionel in the dark suit with the collar piece he had not wanted to wear, both of them looking at each other rather than at the camera. Ella looked at that photograph sometimes when she was standing at the stove in the morning, and the kitchen was just beginning to warm and the house was still quiet. She looked at the 2 people in it, 31 and 35, standing in the May sun with 10 years of shared life not yet lived, and she felt for them a tenderness that included the full knowledge of everything that came after. She had not cooked for another soul in 4 years. And then she had filled 2 plates and walked 2 miles in the October cold, and found a man in a kitchen with tools on the table and terrible coffee. And the rest of it had followed as naturally as weather, as inevitably as the seasons turning through the New Mexico high country, one into the next, each one carrying what was necessary for the next to begin. In the September of 1896, on a warm and golden afternoon that felt like the best kind of memory while it was still happening, Ella Wallace Underwood stood at the kitchen stove of the house that was entirely and completely hers, stirring the soup she was making for supper. And she thought about the morning 11 years ago when she had stood at a different stove with a wooden spoon in her hand, and understood for the first time in 4 years what it meant to cook for someone. The soup was the same one, or near enough to it. Carrots and squash and onion and the dried chilies from the garden. The recipe built from what had been in a crate on a porch one October morning in 1884. She had made it many hundreds of times since. It was the meal she made when she wanted to say something she did not have words for, and she had made it on every anniversary of the morning she first opened the door and saw the crate, because it seemed right to mark that morning, the morning everything had begun to turn. She heard Lionel come in from the yard, heard him stop at the basin to wash, heard his boots on the floor behind her, and she felt the warm, specific weight of his presence in the room the way she felt weather, as a thing the whole body registers. He came to stand beside her at the stove and looked at the soup. 11 years, he said. 11 years, she agreed. He put his arm around her shoulders and looked at the pot, and the smell of the chili and the squash rose in the warm kitchen air. I was terrified to leave that crate, he said. She looked up at him. He had never told her this. Were you? She said. I stood at your gate for 5 minutes in the dark, he said. I had the crate and I stood there thinking, she is going to think I am the most presumptuous man in the territory. What made you do it anyway? She said. He thought about this. I thought, what if she makes something good from it? That seemed worth being thought presumptuous. She turned toward him and put her free hand against his chest, and he looked down at her with the open and immediate expression, the one she had loved from the beginning and still loved with the same particular quality of recognition, like finding a known landmark in the dark. She did, Ella said. She made something very good from it. He kissed her forehead. From somewhere in the house came the sound of James dropping something that was either not breakable or had already been broken before he dropped it, and Clara's voice raised in immediate commentary, and Thomas's deeper voice intervening with some form of adjudication, and the whole familiar architecture of their life sounding itself through the rooms. Supper will be ready in 20 minutes, she called, and heard the children respond with the usual complex negotiations over whose turn it was to set the table, and she turned back to the stove and stirred the soup and felt the warmth of the kitchen and the warmth of the man beside her and the warmth of the life that spread in all directions around them, deep-rooted and real, the kind of life that does not arrive all at once but is built day by day from the materials at hand. From a crate of vegetables left in the dark, from a note written in heavy pencil by a careful hand. From a woman who cooked enough soup for 2 on a morning when she had not cooked for another soul in 4 years, and who picked up her coat and walked. From a man who stood at a gate in the dark with a crate in his arms and thought, what if she makes something good from it? From 2 plates set on a table, 2 cups of terrible coffee, a first October snow, a Christmas notebook, a name said quietly as though setting it somewhere safe, a proposal in turned earth with dirt on both their hands, and all the ordinary extraordinary days that followed, laid one against the next like the pages of a long and honest book, each one necessary, none of them wasted, every single one of them read. The soup was ready. She ladled it into bowls, one for each of them, and called the family to the table, and they came, all of them, noisy and immediate and present, and sat down together in the warm kitchen light. And Lionel Underwood looked at his wife across the full table the way he had been looking at her for 11 years, and she looked back at him. And the soup was good, and the evening was long, and they had, in every way that mattered, all the time in the world.